When we first got into it, our view was that the business was going to be enormous in terms of the opportunity and the addressable market. Spoke about that a little bit last week on our earnings call. Given the size of the company, if the opportunity were small, frankly, it would just be a distraction. It wouldn't be enough to really drive long-term value to shareholders. So the opportunity has to be meaningful in order for us to really get to the place where we wanted to invest in it in a big way. We talked about on the earnings call our experience in Chicago, and if we roll back the clock about 3 years ago, we had about 100 miles of fiber in Chicago, and virtually all of those miles were in the central business district of Chicago. We had in the neighborhood of about 300 tenant nodes on that 100 miles of fiber, so roughly about 3 tenant nodes per mile of fiber. And today, we've got 1,100 nodes in the Chicago market, 1,100 nodes on air, under construction, and that's across about 250 miles of fiber. And what's interesting, since 2013 to today, over that roughly three-year period of time, virtually all of that additional 150 miles of fiber has been built outside of the central business district. And so we've increased the number of nodes per mile to about 5. In the central business district, it's a little higher than that, and outside of the central business district, it's a little bit lower than that. But the vast majority of the capital and the deployment, as we looked at expanding that network, has come outside of the central business district. And as we think about the opportunity, we think Chicago is just a microcosm of what's happening everywhere. As we look at not just top 10, top 5 markets in the U.S., but top 25, top 50, top 100 markets, we think over the next decade, you're going to see a significant amount of investment by the wireless operators to enhance and improve their network using small cells. We think one day the opportunity we have in front of us in small cells could be as big as the tower business we run today, with nearly $3 billion of revenue. We think that's inside of the realm of possibility that on the small cell side, we own and operate a business that's as large as the tower business. So we're obviously in the very early days of that, but it's not an insignificant business even today, with about $400 million in revenue. So it's early days and it's somewhat nascent, but at the same time, we're seeing seeds that would suggest enormous amounts of growth.
So a lot of change since you began when you were 12 years old in the industry.
A lot of change. Yeah.
And when you started, it was just towers.
It was just towers, and paging was about 12% of our revenues. And I remember having conversations around how bad it was going to be that pagers were going away, and how as an industry were we ever going to find revenue to replace the paging revenues, which sounds ridiculous today. But, yeah.
Well, those for us too. We were the Paging Association, PCIA. Our predecessor name was really Pagers, and then as the pagers went away, the towers were still standing. People thought, "Wow, those are pretty valuable." What are those? So let's chat maybe about the evolution of wireless technology at a very high level. What's the role of small cells in network densification as we move toward a 5G world? And even before 5G, we're seeing a lot of small cell activity now. It's starting to pick up and ramp up.
Yeah, where we're seeing small cells being used is to enhance and improve the capacity of the networks that the carriers are working on. And it's different than what we saw in the early days of towers, and even as towers have developed over time. In the tower business, it's largely a longitude, latitude, a specific spot on the map where the tower had to be located, and you tried to get as close to that spot on the map as possible. And the reason for that was obviously geographic coverage and then capacity as data services started to develop. And what we're seeing around small cells, though, is small cells come into the environment, the wireless environment, where there's an existing series of towers that are providing good macro coverage, voice coverage obviously, and reasonable data service. And they go into places where you're trying to offload some of the data traffic that's going through the tower onto small cells in order to improve the cost effectiveness and the efficiency of the macro sites. And the small cells are not necessarily as pinpoint accuracy in the same way that it was with towers. anywhere inside of the radius or the circumference of a tower where the data load is significant on the tower or on the network there, offloads some of that traffic onto the small cell, which improves the overall capacity of that macro site and returns it to closer to the effectiveness that it was originally designed. And as I said before, we're seeing that all over the place in all of the major markets as kind of the next leg of deployment. So oftentimes people have compared it to overhead lights and lamps, where the overhead lights are providing good coverage and capacity in the network. That would be the macro sites. And then you go in and put a series of lamps in to accentuate the lighting situation in a given room, and those become the small cells, which are really helpful for offloading some of the data traffic.
That's a great image. I can use that one. Well, we're moving toward smart cities. You know, a lot of the discussion at the conference, and the entire conference actually just came from on smart cities. How do you think small cells and DAS will play a role in that?
Well, it's going to play an important role, because when you talk about things like smart cities, or you talk about, I realize the next guest up is going to be from Uber, talk about things like driverless cars, or if you get really big and start talking about the Internet of Things, all of those are driven by mobile technology and the necessity of having what is really a ubiquitous coverage with a high amount of data capacity inside of those networks. So we think that is a part of what is this big driver towards improving the ubiquitousness and increasing the data capacity of the networks. And what's interesting to us is all of those, whether it's driverless cars, smart cities, if you talk about things like the Internet of Things, all of those are potential revenue opportunities for our carrier customers. And it's unclear today maybe exactly how that revenue model is ultimately going to play out. But we have, as consumers, have proven over a long period of time that we'll pay for quality data services. And as more of our lives are interacting with those data services, there will be a cost to us as consumers, if not direct, maybe indirect, but those become revenue streams for the wireless operators, and those revenue streams will justify a further investment in their network. And as we have looked and thought about kind of the future around wireless, we think that things like smart cities make sense because they're gonna ultimately drive additional revenues and cash flow, and that will result in additional investment, which we think will benefit from both as an industry and then obviously specifically at Crown Castle.
Yeah, sure will help the whole ecosystem. And you know, a lot of folks here in the room and in the industry live and die on carrier capex, and they're watching. I'm sure you watch like a hawk what you see as carrier capex. People assume the carriers are you know, have unlimited amounts when they're out there consuming their devices, but in fact they're spending huge amounts to just keep up with the demand. And while their ARPU is going down, it's a tough situation. What do you kind of see in terms of trends in carrier capex? And one of the carriers just bought or is trying to buy a $100 billion asset. How is this going to play out? And what do you think? What do you kind of think the trends are in carrier capex for both small cells and for macros?
Yeah, they're good stewards of capital, and they're doing what you would expect reasonable business people to do. They're balancing their desire to invest and grow their business, and at the same time return reasonable returns to their shareholders. In most cases, that takes the form of dividends. And so they're distributing a portion of that cash flow, and at the same time continuing to invest in their network. And as we think about CapEx, the most asked question to me from our investors is, what's the inflection point? Okay, at what point are the carriers going to start to spend meaningfully more than what they're currently investing to improve their network or to drive capacity in the network? And that's possible. It's possible that there's an inflection point and significant more investment. I think it's frankly an unlikely outcome. I think what you're more likely to see is the level of capital that's being spent by the carriers today continuing over a long period of time. And it's, in essence, extending the runway of growth. So as we talk about some of the things that are on the frontier and what's coming next, I think of that as extending the years of runway of growth for our businesses. And there may never be an inflection point. We may never reach a day when we see significantly more CapEx spent by the carriers. But I think we are going to go through a very long period of time, decade plus, where we see consistent investment by the carriers to continue to improve the networks. In many ways, the CapEx becomes almost a maintenance CapEx level where they consistently invest in their networks over the long term. And I think they've proven themselves to do that over the last 4 to 5 years, where you've seen really consistent levels of spend across the industry.
I've heard some folks in the industry say we're maybe in a bit of a trough between 4G and 5G, that when they ramped up the 4G, we had that big push 2013, 14, and things have settled down a bit, but that maybe it'll ramp up again in 5G. I'm not sure what the inflection point is, you said, but do you expect that we're going to see a better influx when 2020 rolls around and they have to start deploying these 5G networks, or do you think a lot of that's built in earlier?
It seems like there's always a normal ebb and flow to the business where the carriers will go through a period of time where they're really focused on maybe it's the deployment of the next technology, or maybe it's improving the capacity of their networks. And then as they reach the end of the project that they're working on or the focus that they have, they take a step back, evaluate the network. That may feel to us like a bit of a lull, as some people would refer to it. And then they plan for the next activity, and then we see after that a long period of time where they're investing based on a targeted approach. Our perspective would be that they're pretty thoughtful about the way they deploy their networks, and we've seen them do that through a number of different business cycles. And frankly, I think as I'm talking to investors about our business, that's really the distinguishing aspect of our industry, is that so while someone might look at it and say it's a lull, the lulls in our industry have been off maybe 10% in terms of incremental growth. And you really can't go, but we can't in our own business go back over the last decade and find periods of time where that lull represented more than about a 10% down or 10% on the positive side. It stayed in a relatively similar range, which has made the business very predictable. And that predictability has driven an enormous amount of capital into this business. So I would describe their activities as being thoughtful and really predictable, steady amounts of investment as they've smartly built out their networks, and we've all benefited from that.
Well, that's within those kind of bounds. Where do you see the sort of special investment opportunities in small cells, as folks here in the room are thinking about opportunities and where capital should be wisely deployed as they're looking ahead? Where do you think the opportunities are in small cell for enterprise, or where would you see?
Yeah, we certainly expect them to be geographically. We think they're going to be meaningful in the top 100 markets in the U.S. We don't believe it's a strategy limited solely to the top 10, top 20 markets. We think we'll see it continue to deploy well beyond the top 20 markets in the U.S., probably at least through the top 100 markets in the U.S. We think the timeline will probably look something not dissimilar to what we saw with towers, where they'll start in city centers and then move their way out towards more suburban areas. That's been the pattern in the top 5 to 10 markets that we've seen them do. So we think that geographic focus will continue. And then how they select those sites, again, we think most of that selection will be driven by improving the cost effectiveness and efficiency of their existing macro network.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, we talked a little bit in my speech about the challenges the industry faces on a lot of levels. When you look at it as the new CEO of Crown, what are some of the biggest challenges you face, and how do you plan to address them?
Yeah, most of the challenges, one of the great things about the business is most of the challenges that we face are fixed with a lot of focus and hard work and effort and smart thinking. And so most of what we do is about doing the right thing day in and day out. And we've got to do it on the tower side 40,000 times a day, and on the small cell side a number of times a day, where we're trying to make really good, thoughtful capital allocation decisions, and then operating the business. Specifically to some of the things that you referenced in your speech earlier, the deployment aspects of small cells are really challenging. And I don't have to, this is like explaining the flood to Noah for those of you in the room. But small cells are far harder to deploy than towers ever will. And I think there have been a number of people who got into the small cell business and thought, well, this is just kind of like the next tower business, and so we'll go build some small cells. And I think people pretty quickly learn, it's a heck of a lot harder to deploy small cells than it is towers. And what we see, obviously from an actual operational aspect, it's more difficult. But as we're working with municipalities, we found it to be much more challenging. Typically on the tower side, the conversations that we had in order to move through a process of building a tower was generally limited to a particular neighborhood where we were trying to win a homeowners association's approval of that or some local person's approval of that, and then using that to make our way through city council. And on the small cell side, the amount of reach, both on the political side as well as outreach to the community, is significantly greater. So our own internal group around PR, using social media, using connections inside of communities, developing political relationships that can help us through that, and really making the case for why it's important for a particular community to enhance the viability of their mobile networks, how it improves the safety of those communities and improves the way they live, and then balancing with that the aesthetic concerns that any community has. And so we've become better at that, but given the scale of what's in front of us, we're going to have to get even better at it. So in terms of challenges, that's at the very top of the list of how do we balance the aesthetics and desires of the local communities and deploy networks at a reasonable pace and for a reasonable cost that makes them attractive to our customers.
Well, we're there to help, and that's what we do every day at WI, is try to make that environment. I think your message about what we deliver is exactly right. I mean, the vast bulk of the community wants the service, and there's this handful of people that are worried about spurious concerns about RF, or they're worried about aesthetics. But, you know, we've got to get beyond that and get to the essence of what it means to the community. I think that's just the message you're sending out there.
Yeah, it is. We've got to spread that message. And I would tell you, generally, we found, maybe 20 years ago in the tower business, our experience was people didn't want them. I think the general, as we've done focus groups and go into a community and study the community's view of what we're going to do with small cells, the general population is very favorable towards mobile and towards wireless, and they're generally favorable towards having improved networks and improved service. They still don't want it in their own backyard, but they're generally favorable. And so working with those communities, we found that to be a very profitable endeavor. And as you spoke about at the regulatory level, both at the federal level and at the state level, we found folks to be balanced and appropriate in terms of that. So we may not always agree, but it seems like we're getting to pretty good resolutions and pretty good grounds where we can invest capital and make good returns.
Yeah, we're making some progress. Now, your company was really thinking around the corner a little bit when it came to fiber and investing in fiber assets. And how important are those to your vision, and how do you sort of see fiber playing a role in the rollout of small cell and DAS networks?
Yeah, fiber is the asset for small cell nodes. And so for the most part, where we've acquired fiber thus far has been in places where we had customer contracts for tenant nodes, and we were going to be deploying a number of small cell nodes in a given geography. And our assessment was that it was a more cost-effective approach to buy the fiber rather than to go and build it. Fiber makes up about 85% of the cost of our small cell systems, and we often describe it as the fiber as a tower laid on its side. So our goal is to put as many nodes across a given set of fiber as we possibly can, and that's how we drive returns, in the same way that we try to put as many tenants on a vertical tower as possible in order to drive the returns. So fiber is really the asset, and as we evaluate that asset, it's about lining up where across the landscape are the needs for increased density of data networks, and where does that fiber footprint that we may be looking at, where does that line up? And the ones that we've done so far have lined up nicely, where those two things, the demand on the data side and the fiber, have lined up nicely.
They sure have. Well, you employ a lot of people across the United States, I think over 2,000 employees, and when you look, you said how difficult it is to deploy small cells versus the old towers that you used to do. Do you think the workforce is where it needs to be, and what do you think we need to do in terms of training? I know you're engaged in TIRAP. What do you see as the need for the workforce in the future, and how's Crown kind of engaging and preparing the way?
Yeah, so we have about 2,000 employees on the tower side, and we've got about 1,000 on the small cell fiber side. We found it to be incredibly challenging to find people to fill those roles. It's one of the biggest challenges that we face as we've grown the small cell business, because there were not a lot of people who had experience, obviously, in the space, being new. And so we've worked pretty hard at bringing some folks outside of telecom into the industry and teaching them the business. And I feel like we're getting our sea legs there a little bit, where we're getting better at identifying folks who could come into the business and do well. We've done well hiring veterans, and particularly those who were employed around communication jobs in the military. And they've come in and done a phenomenal job with us. We've worked pretty hard on developing some university and college programs to recruit folks straight out of school and teach them the business, and that's worked pretty well. But there is no question a talent shortage and across the industry, and that'll be one of the big things as an industry that we face around training. From a skill set standpoint, obviously a big part of this is forward-looking. So what's next? And so the level of creativity and the level of relationship building and connecting with people inside of local communities has been a meaningful part of how we've been successful thus far, and we're going to have to get even better at it to scale the business to the level of our aspirations. So it's going to be a pretty creative, collaborative workforce, and we're going to have to be pretty focused around how do we recruit folks in and then train them and get them ready to be able to do the jobs.
Well, good. We're happy to work with you on that. WIA, we're with you on the challenge. I think a lot of people in this room will be able to help too in establishing kind of the standards and the curriculum to give people the skills they need to do the job right, because it is a new industry, and so we're excited to work with you on that. Might have just a few minutes left here. If there's any questions folks have for Jay, let us know. Any burning questions? Yes, Jeff.
So, Jay, I'm not sure what the overall international exposure is for small cell development, but can you compare?
I was wanting to know, kind of from your perspective, because you see it much broader scale across the country and as well as the globe. How does the United States compare from a small cell fiber deployment percentage of completion, let's say, versus some of the other major countries in the world?
We're a little behind Asia Pacific, but way ahead of the European market. The European market would be a perfect place for small cells, given the density of the population, which is significantly more dense than what we have here in the States. So the opportunity in Europe is very meaningful, and I don't know whether that'll be something we will ultimately pursue, but I do think you'll see a significant increase in the number of small cells in Europe. Obviously, given the way the consumers use the devices, the amount of data traffic that we have going across our devices in the U.S. is significantly higher than that of the European average. So they haven't had quite the data capacity issues in Europe that we've had in the States. So they haven't had to worry about it as much as what we have in the U.S. But I don't think that's a sustainable gap between Europe and the U.S. So I think that's likely to close.
Maybe one last question about who's going to pay for small cell. I remember when I first started here, the question about DAS was who's going to pay for it? And in small cell, same thing. The carriers are doing a lot of their own deployments, but there isn't enough capital to go around all the mid-sized buildings out there that need this kind of a system. And when somebody's building a new building, I was amazed that the Freedom Tower in New York, when it was built, didn't have a system designed in it. After what happened in 9/11 to the World Trade Center, of all the buildings you think would have a ubiquitous wireless system, they had to sort of construct it afterwards. They got it done before the building was done, but they didn't have that in the original plans. But now it's getting to the point where it's a utility like any other. I mean, you wouldn't expect that a developer building a building would ask the water company to pay for the toilets and the plumbing and the sinks. Right. But somehow people building a new building think that the carriers are going to pay for their wireless networks, and the people expect that in their system. How are we going to get enterprise to sort of realize that they're going to have to help pay for the utility within their own building like they do the electric or other utilities?
We're seeing that model change a little bit with some of the high-end residential apartment buildings. You see that in that area. We see it less in places like office buildings. And I don't know what will ultimately change that. Obviously, by having to build those mobile networks, we're eating into the margins of those real estate operators and owners, and so I think they've been slow to make that as an amenity, so to speak. But I think some of that is starting to change. But it's relatively minimal, Jonathan, today of the activity that we've seen on that front, and it makes it really challenging to go into an office building and build a system in scale across the country. You know, there are clearly opportunities in certain markets where it makes sense, and we do it, whether it's a venue or an office building or other places. But that model just has not proven out to get the right returns on capital thus far. So we're more focused on the outdoor space, and venues make up a little less than about 5% of our small cell revenues at this point.
Hopefully we can make that change. One of the things that HeadNet Forum does is work in verticals to try to encourage them to recognize that it's something that they need, and it's a lot cheaper getting it done going in than trying to retrofit. So hopefully we can change that sooner, but it's a challenge. Well, thank you so much for being here. Let's give a big round of applause for Dave Brown.